I'm not by any means an expert on global health governance, but what I have found extremely kind of revelatory and also very shocking is to try and understand what it is that comprises global health governance in terms of its structures and systems. And then to map them out and to see what are the interlinkages and nexuses that one finds there. Look at the world in terms of malnutrition. This is where India stands. These are well-known figures. I'm sure that this August group knows it very well. Now, so the rock in the hard place is that it's a huge problem, and it's also offering a huge market. What are the fundamental reasons? Again, fairly clearly understood. All pervasive poverty in the era of massive and sustained economic growth. That is what we have to contend with. Massive and growing inequity, which is again well demonstrated. Skyrocketing food prices, especially for those things that give us calorie density and those things that give us protein requirements in food. Very, very still a poor status of women on the whole. And the usual unsafe water, sanitation, healthcare services, no support for childcare. Very, very critical piece of the malnutrition picture which usually gets missed. But in Indian situations where 97% of all women are working in the informal sector, where no laws apply, no regulations apply, no maternity leave applies, no sickness leave applies, no childcare services exist. This is one of the bedrocks of why malnutrition continues to persist. And I think this last point is very important for us as when we come to proximal determinants of malnutrition, that the diet is very, very poor in animal sources of protein. So this is just a relative, sorry, it's sort of, the figures are hiding somewhere down there. But if you look at India in terms of meat and eggs and compare it to China and the US, forget about the unit, but just look at it in reference of comparison. Look at this massive difference. US 120 something and India at 5.3, and similarly here. And in some way, this is fundamental to whatever strategies we then think of in terms of tackling malnutrition. Yeah, now, see, here in the title I say responses by government and technocracy, because again and again we will refer to the point that eventually it's government that does things. But it is under the influence of various agencies, and that's what global health governance is all about. And in this issue, the issue of malnutrition, the technocracy, which basically relates to the multilateral agencies involved, UNICEF and WHO play a very massive role. It plays to the what we call here the donor partners, which are bilateral agencies, many of which we all know, DFID, etc., USAID, some of those. And it is also donor agencies in the sense of international NGOs. There are many that relate to child rights that exist here. So there's Plan International, there's Save the Children Fund, and all these work as a kind of resource pool that suggest strategies that develop and promote research, that develop and promote publications, etc. And they, in a sense, they dominate the world of, basically suggesting solutions to problems that the country faces, and then the government incorporates them through various agencies, through committees, commissions, consultations, etc. And finally, it's the government, of course, that takes decisions on all these fronts. So what has been happening in the background of all this, that there's been this great playing down of poverty. I don't know how many of you have been reading about the BPL, the below poverty line, and the whole drama around how to prove the point about who in this country is poor or not, the arbitrary lines that are drawn, and then the arguments for and against, the problems of lack of inclusion, wrong inclusion, exclusion, and all this which should happen when we try to target very narrowly. And you know, this universalization versus targeting is another cross-cutting thing that's going to keep coming up in health strategies. Somebody referred to it as the difference between public health and right to health. But I think in this case, it is absolutely common sense public health that if you have a problem that affects 70 to 80% of your entire population, and and probably over 90% of your entire poor population, then what sense does it make to hunt out the 80, 90%? Would it not make more sense to hunt out the 10%? I'll exclude them. I mean, even in terms of cost-benefit analysis, in this case, which is food insecurity, malnutrition, it is something that is near universal. So obviously strategies need to be near universal, strategies for food security, even if we don't consider from the rights approach or whatever, and you use it from this narrow interpretation of public health that people have been referring to. There has been a kind of lip service to comprehensive food security through what is now the National Food Security Bill. This is now in a situation of fair advance, and it's now at the level of the Parliamentary Standing Committee, and we are told that it may come in the next session of Parliament, though I think it probably will not, but sooner or later it will come. Now, it calls itself a food security bill, but essentially it limits itself to the distribution, to qualifying how much food grain at what rates which people are going to get. So it limits food security to the distribution of food, only food grains, only food cereals in fact, not even food stuff, and it limits itself to laying down a minimum kind of price at which that is going to be made available. So all the issues that we understand to be related to child malnutrition are possibly not covered here, except, now this is also the thing, that wherever we see problems, we are also seeing some positives happen, and I think it's as a result of all our common kind of action and the civil society work that Yashodhara was referring to. So in this bill, we have a very revolutionary thing happening also. I think ma'am has also been partially responsible for that. And that is, it gives credence to maternity protection as a support to children's right to exclusively breastfeed. For the first time, acknowledging that maternity, that mothers need support to be able to exclusively breastfeed. So there is a line for maternity protection there, but there's no line for creches, for example, childcare services. And there is no line to give legal legitimacy to the largest system that we have for food security in the country today, which is the Integrated Child Development Services Scheme, ICDS. For those who've been following the issue of malnutrition, you know about it. So the ICDS is presumed, which is a system for children under 6, but it is not incorporated to be given legal guarantees through this. And this is the one system which does not have legal guarantees in any law. So schools have legal guarantee. Hospitals still don't have legal guarantee, really, except by interpretation of the Constitution. And so this play school, Anganwadi, what we call the ICDS system, still doesn't have a legal guarantee. And the NFSP also chooses not to do that. Now, in the last, I mean, since we've been independent, we've been tracking what families are eating. And I refer to the gap, the huge gap in proteins and calorie, which, in my opinion, results in the huge micronutrient deficiency gap also, to 80 to 90%. So we have this huge gap in children getting good quality, diverse food. Now, we have made absolutely no investment in making that happen. The supplementary food programs of the country have invested basically in delivery of more cereals. Now, cereals is a staple that poor people and poor children eat anyway, and what we do is also give them more cereal. What the National Food Security Bill is also doing is giving them more cereal. What we need is to give milk, eggs, fruits, vegetables, all that. But what we are actually doing is giving more cereal. So we have really not invested in making good quality, diverse food available for all children. And there are many arguments that go into it. One of the arguments, which is a funny argument, is that we are a vegetarian country, which we are not. 70 to 80% of our country is tribal. They eat beef, they eat pork, they eat meat, they eat insects, they eat everything. I mean, they used to traditionally when it was available to them. Now they've been dispossessed of their forests, of their land, and they're more and more dependent on services. And so, not by choice, but by force, people are eating very little meat and all that. So in exchange for all this that we've been saying, so systems for care, for health, for protection, and systems for food of good quality, instead of that, what we're constantly being offered in various ways and through various means is single component technical solutions, nutraceutical products. So there is this problem for which it is considered that there is no alternative except to be using certain products. which are how we refer to them as nutraceutical products in parallel with pharmaceuticals. Instead of doing all that, which are the social determinants of malnutrition, this is what the strategy is a dominant kind of theme today. So there are biscuits of various varieties. I've listed, all this has a lot of factual detail behind it, and one can make that available. There are biscuits, and you'll see the agencies also. I'm sure some of you recognize GAIN, which is a front agency, I believe, for corporates, which is really involving itself as a nutrition support agency, as a resource group. It's very clearly, it had Danone in its board, and, et cetera, et cetera. So, and it's very closely and intimately has been involved with UNICEF's work. It's done some good work, and has also not done some good work. So biscuits is one. Ready to eat versus hot cooked meals is the other thing that we see constantly. Constant push. Sometimes we win the battle, sometimes they win the battle. It's a constant ongoing push. Ready to eat pre-packaged food, pre-processed food as compared to hot cooked meals in centers, in the ICDS Anganwadi centers. And there are again examples. We won this battle against something called Christie Fried Gram International in Karnataka. I say ongoing, but we won this battle. But 2 months after that battle was won, I just heard yesterday, now Vedant, another corporate group with its corporate social responsibility, is wanting to bring in yet another pre-packaged product. So it's an ongoing kind of game, and they keep making moves, and we keep trying to fight them. Then RUTF for SAM, this became quite internationally reputed, this whole struggle, the whole debate around it. Plumpy Nut was the one that sparked off the debate, and there subsequently have been Plumpy Nut analogs. And actually, this really pushed us to look at the research, to understand this technically, and to create technical arguments vis-a-vis Plumpy Nut, to try to offer alternatives, because I keep coming back to that point. It's very, very important, very critical to say it's not that we're saying nothing should be done for malnutrition. We're saying this should be done, this can be done, and it's effective. And it should be done for these reasons, effectivity being one, but also because it takes into consideration so many other things, so many processes that involve communities, that are sustainable, that protect cultural preferences, that protect biodiversity, that protect local agriculture, that protect livelihoods. So if you can look after the distal determinants as well as have an impact that you desire through proximal ones, why should you not do that? But in doing this, in creating these arguments, we realized that we did not have primary evidence, that the agencies who are supposed to be creating evidence, supposed to be doing research, supposed to be looking dispassionately, objectively at things, did not ask these questions, did not ask the right questions. So essentially, we had to go ahead and do it ourselves with very little resources, or we had to push them, and then they did. So, when we confronted them on these issues, they started to engage with them, and they were also forced to look at these alternatives. But when we actually examined research, for example, we found research that said, that compared a certain product with nothing. It compared a certain product with a kind of watery gruel. You don't need to do research to say that would be more effective. And the point is also that nobody denies the efficacy of the product. Like Sir said, that GM per se, there's nothing wrong with. Some of these packaged foods, there's nothing per se wrong with. Point is, if you could do it better locally, using a non-patented product, using a process that involves communities, women, they can understand what nutritious food is, they can gain livelihoods from it, you use local produce, why should you not do it? Why should you not do it? And therefore, that brings into question the idea that everything is naive. I wish it were. I mean, there are really good individuals everywhere in all these agencies, but there seems to be a very, very concerted move to open this market to companies and to multinationals. So the other examples are wheat fortification for anemia. This is a burning hot topic. Anybody who's interested in the technicalities of it, again, one must go down to the primary research on fortification for anemia and see what it does, how useful it is, how does it displace local processes and livelihoods. Is it worth it? Do you really get the impact that you want on anemia, or do you not even get that? So in all these products, we have learned to dispute the claims, as with GM. The claim that it is highly efficacious, and the claim that there is no alternative. Both these things have to be simultaneously exposed, and I think this is what part of global health governance, the job of global health governance is to do, but unfortunately they don't seem to do it. Supplements via syrups and sprinkles. Now, micronutrient has become the vehicle to carry nutraceuticals forward. The fact that it's very difficult sometimes to acquire micronutrients through, at least through the food that people are eating currently, it certainly is not. It's not easy to get your requirements of iron from the food that currently people are eating, even what currently middle class is eating. So there are some genuine problems. With vitamin A, there may be a genuine problem, but I don't think so. With iron, there definitely seems to be. So there is a space for micronutrients. And there is a genuine micronutrient gap. Now, what I said earlier, that why is it that we forget that there is a macronutrient gap of good quality food that, if satisfied, would cover 80 to 90% of the micronutrient gap. This is what one must remember, that 10% we need to cover through other means, which are drugs. So essentially what we're doing, and what we're doing in GM also, we are creating a food-drug confusion that is taking over food in the same way as drugs necessarily had to be taken over, because you can't cook drugs in your kitchen, but you can make food in your home. And this distinction should never, never, never be forgotten. You do need very precise millimoles of medicine. But as a doctor, I know they're not that precise either. Every tablet of paracetamol has actually slightly different weights and measures. And so this is where the politics of standards come in. Do we need to apply these kind of stringent standards to all food stuff? To centralize production? Or can we say, let food be food, and let the medical components required be added as medicine? This is the fundamental kind of position that we are trying to take. Yeah. So these are the common strategies that have been used by the global players and the international players to do all this. One is the medicalization of something that is just coming from the lack of food, which anybody can understand. So you medicalize it and you mystify it. You make it out into something that only a few experts can understand. Therefore, the answer to that also becomes medical, technical, and expert-driven, rather than commonsensical. Then you centralize means of production. You want to produce food as a drug, but you also want to escape all the responsibilities of producing a drug at the same time. So these are not governed. Nutraceuticals are not governed by the same laws as pharmaceuticals, but you use the same argument to centralize their production. Then you apply stringent standards to food products. And you overplay certain characteristics that favor centralized production. For example, this is a local court case, I mean Supreme Court case. Supreme Court judgment gave us a very important instrument and a very important tool, very powerful tool, in the Right to Food case, 2001. The same Supreme Court, you know, this is the two edges of the sword. In another petition, said food delivered to children through public services should be untouched by human hands. Why? I mean, are children going to be looked after by robots at home? So, yes, those hands should be washed. But why should the food be untouched by, meaning to say only machines should therefore create food for children. But these are the same children who are going to pick up stuffed toys and put them in their mouth. They're drinking water that is completely unsafe for human consumption in around 70% of the country. So see, these are the arguments that kind of help that whole business. And then you universalize distribution. So there's this vertical and horizontal expansion that industry uses for its products. You go all the way down the line, and you also cross-cut everything that leads into malnutrition. So if you're a company, you'll make the micronutrients also, you'll make the nutraceuticals also, you'll make whatever products that are required in the broad arena of malnutrition, and you go all the way down in the sense that what starts off as something that is required only for severely acutely malnourished children for a period of 15 days, then becomes adapted to mild and moderate as well, then becomes adapted to all children, as we've been seeing with packaged food in the middle class in the open market. So, and we see that there's evidence for this. So in Somalia, for example, we had Plumpy Nut that was for severe acute malnutrition, but then we had Plumpy Dose for mild and moderate. So leaves what? I mean, what should, that means all children have to be feeding either on Plumpy Dose or Plumpy Nut. There's going to be no good quality normal food for children at all, or no investment for that. So there's a vertical and a horizontal expansion that goes on. And it's a standalone product distribution without process. Products are important, they're going to be required. But what we're doing is the entire strategy rests on the distribution of a product without talking of processes. So nutrition counseling, all those things that you need to do alongside, you're not doing. Lack of an adequate research, I've already said there's a seduction. And there is also inducement. So conflicts of interest in recommending bodies, partnering with Nestle, PepsiCo, Kraft, Horlicks. For nutrition-related work, we have examples of all this happening. So these are common consequences. There's an opportunity cost. If you invest very heavily in products, you don't invest in processes, you don't invest in all the preventative and promotive aspects. In Afghanistan, one activist who was part of this conversation was almost crying. He's saying 95% of the entire budget was going into therapeutic food, with nothing left for breastfeeding counseling, for creating systems for care, for healthcare, etc. And I think there are studies in Africa where these products have been used for decades. We have not started, but in Africa, they've been in use for decades. What has been the population level impact on malnutrition in Africa? There are now studies which I've seen, I think at least 2 or 3, that are showing no impact, that there's anecdotal evidence that people sell this because it's considered special and valuable because it's coming in a packet, etc., or that they don't like it because it's not, it's not culturally acceptable, etc. So there is evidence to say, does it have the impact that it has promised? And that also seems to be doubtful. Then there's a direct impact, as I said, on local food production. Millets is, our country is basically not producing enough millets anymore. And millets, as we know, is a huge source of protein, of iron, of other micronutrients, and it used to be the traditional food for all our poor communities. Now we're going back to saying we must promote millets, but millets has gone out of production in many areas now because of cash cropping, because of the whole thrust on wheat and rice. So there has been an impact on agriculture, on local food production, local livelihoods, for example, milling in the instance of fortification of wheat with iron. Yeah, running out of time. So basically, what we're doing is perennial food aid versus food sovereignty through using all these methods. There have been some protective policies and there have been some dangerous policies. So like I said, there's a contest on. It's not a given. It's not as though everything is lost, as Yashodhara was saying. There's a continuous kind of engagement required to keep an oversight on this and to keep doing. I think this business of PPPs coming up in all policies is very, very dangerous and is really fraught with problems. These are the parallels in history and geography. I think the ORS saga is a good case study. The vitamin A case study is also a very good case study to explicate all these problems. And look at what we've learned from pharmaceuticals. Just look at this quote, which I use quite frequently. There's a race to the middle between pharma and food. The opportunity is big, the risk is big, the reward is big. This is the head of Nestle saying this to us. We have a positive experience from Thailand. We have the African experience, which I've referred to already. And I think I've said enough about this. Yeah, this is important because it links in with other things, that there's a struggle for patents as well, patents and markets. There's some facts here which you will see from my presentation which just explicate what UNICEF, how UNICEF, what they did, what USA did, what so-and-so did, what so-and-so did, and finally how it was adopted by the government and how it was really used. So the main issues in global health governance, this is from an activist perspective because I'm not involved directly with global health governance. I don't know, I may be completely wrong, but this is how we think these are the important issues. There is a funding problem and a conflict of interest in multilateral bodies. And there is a top-down decision-making rather than a consultative one. I think there's very poor engagement with civil society. We should really be pushing processes rather than products. We should not be defining strategies at global level at all. We can hardly afford to do that at national level. Things are very, very different in different parts of the world, in different parts of the same country. We must, I think, speak of key principles and non-negotiables rather than define exactly to the millimole what a child sitting somewhere needs to be given. And finally, we must say no to branded interventions in food.